Welcome to Reading Crossbow. My name is Rob, and today I'm doing my midpoint review on Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahurin. This is a romantasy that was selected for us to read this month by Lana. If this had been the dark fantasy book I'd selected for us to read this month, she'd be the one doing the midpoint review. So the purpose of this episode is to try to give you an idea of how I feel about this book at about the midpoint of this book. The chapters aren't numbered, but I'm about halfway through, and I wanted to kind of give you an idea of how the book is going so far, and is this the kind of fantasy that I like to read? Spoiler alert, not quite so much, but that doesn't mean that it's not a good book, so let's find out. So as I said, this is definitely not a grim dark fantasy like the kind I like to read, but it might be something you like to read. I'll tell you a little bit about the characters as I understand them so far. There's two point of view characters, Louise LeBlanc, or Lou, and her husband, Reed Diggory. Now, at the start of this book, these two characters aren't married yet. They are, in fact, kind of opposites. Lou is a witch. She performs magic, and this magic can be quite dangerous. Reed, on the other hand, is a witch hunter. It's his occupation to investigate and hunt down witches and other supernatural creatures. Now, with this kind of society, I kind of was starting off with an expectation of, the witches are maybe being persecuted by a culture that maybe doesn't understand them, and Lou is going to win over her witch hunter husband, and he's going to learn to understand witches aren't so bad. And so when the book starts off, it starts off with the Sanderson sisters from Hocus Pocus flying through town in broad daylight trying to assassinate the prince and his family in front of a large audience. So, not quite sure the witches are misunderstood. And not only that, there does seem to be actually multiple types of witches. You see, Lou performs a type of magic that requires balance, whereas there's another type of witch that they use blood as the kind of main component of their magic. So they're actually casting spells. My kind of favorite type of magic. So I'm excited as this story started going, as you even get to see multiple different ways magic is used by the different kinds of witches as they cast spells that have different effects. They have different components of the spells, we'll call it. So this is actually a really kind of interesting magic system so far. I am actually finding this to be my favorite part of the book, is kind of learning more and more about the magic of this world. And as I mentioned earlier, there are even other supernatural creatures. It sounds like there's some kind of werewolf, as well as some sort of maybe fairy or homunculus type creature that are created by the witches. And it does seem like this is a pretty fantastical world. The book so far has taken a place exclusively in a city called Caesarine, in the kingdom of Belterra. Now, all that sounds great. It sounds like a very kind of traditional fantasy story. Until you learn that there's Christianity and traditional medieval style Christianity, and its Inquisition is also in this book. So it's kind of unclear, is this taking place in a fictional country in our world? A country that has actual witches flying through the air, blasting people and driving them mad and cursing them, and also has werewolves that the public is well aware of and are very, very real, not just a mythology or, just something that some people say they've seen. No, this is all very, very real to this world, and they are very afraid. I guess in the past, in real world history, like, people did feel genuinely afraid for witches and what they could do, but not witches that were literally flying around like the Sanderson sisters, just, magic lasering people. So I found this part of the story to be my most challenging part. It's like, is this in the real world? If so, what is the rest of this world like? In fact, so far in the book, they haven't referenced anywhere else that's in this world. We don't know about any other countries, place names, imports. They haven't been like, oh, we have this great wine from France, or we have these great steel from fictional, country. Just no one else is mentioned except for the Christian Catholic Church. So I found that to be kind of just weird. It's a weird call. I actually really would have preferred if it was solidly one or the other, whether it was in the real world or in a fictional world. But this kind of halfway between is like the least satisfying for me. I genuinely just kind of wish they had just like had a Christian analog religion, or made this maybe set in like Luxembourg or something, a place in the real world that was known for its witches and its witch trials. It's just it's a weird story decision, and I kind of wish that it had just went one way or the other. So as I mentioned earlier, the premise of this book is that you have a witch and a witch hunter, and they've been forced to get married, and now they got to find a way to find love in this crazy world they live in. Pretty straightforward tropes, and it's fun. At first I thought the setup for it was a little off, but the more I read into it, it reminded me of another story. And the other story that I'm going to refer to is The Martian by Andy Weir. Now, this is a science fiction story. It actually prides itself on trying to be as accurate as possible for what could happen in the real world. And in this story, it starts off with there's a bunch of astronauts on Mars, and there's a major storm. The wind is so fierce, the astronauts actually abandon their landing location and jump back to space. But they end up having to leave one of their members behind, Mark Watney. And he has to basically survive on the planet until he is going to be rescued. You've probably seen the movie. The book's really good as well. And it's clear, even in interviews with Andy, that he is well aware that the entire setup of that story, which is the storm, isn't plausible. It's the one thing he was like, I just need you to suspend your disbelief for this one part of the story, because it sets everything else up. So I couldn't, there was no other way to really have Mark get left behind, so we're just going to go with this one and just kind of squint real hard and just ignore the kind of craziness of that. And that's what reminds me of this story, because Lou and Reed, the way they get linked together and forced to marry is so implausible. But like The Martian, it's a necessary kind of thing to happen just to get the story moving forward. And I feel like I should, like I did with The Martian, suspend my disbelief on at least the setup of the story so that we can move forward with the actual heart of the story, which is their budding relationship. And so, yeah, it's kind of a weird start, but, it's fine. It gives a reason why they're forced to be married, and we move on. And this is where the story kind of reminds me of a different book that we've already read on this show, which is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Because these two stories have something very much in common, which is the male romantic interest who seems a little bit dangerous, but in general never actually does anything bad. But in both Fourth Wing and Serpent and Dove, the women in the story believe the men to be their enemies and treat them very badly, despite the fact all the romantic side of this story is really being told from their point of view. So it's really kind of strange to me. So is that a trope of these books, that the men really are good from day one, and it's the women who are treating that think they're the bad guy? I don't know. It's weird because the Fourth Wing and Serpent and Dove are very much the most kind of traditionally romantic books we are going to cover so far on this show, and they both experience a lot of very similar tropes as far as how this romance is proceeding. And I'm not sure I like that, the way the story's constructed for both of them. The whole enemies to lovers, the way it's done, I think actually paints the women in a very negative light. And I'm not sure I like that. I think there's got to be another way that this could be done where they're both the characters are kind of equally responsible for the love-hate. Whereas in both of these books, both the male characters seem like they're just trying to do their best and like be helpful, and the women are just assholes. So there's something else in this book that I actually thought was kind of interesting and that we could talk about. So there is a story or a book inside this story. And Reed is trying to, at this point in the story, he is attempting to bond with his new wife, and she's bored, she's kind of stuck, where he lives. He basically lives inside a church, or at least the holy orders part of the church property, and she's kind of stuck there and she's not digging it. So he goes into his secret stash and he pulls out a novel and says, hey, maybe this could keep you entertained. And it is a romance book. And she's like, ooh. He basically says, it's a love story. She's like, huh? Oh? And he's like, well, it's tastefully done. The characters are from warring kingdoms, but they're first forced to work together against a plot that could destroy the world. And they loathe each other initially, but in time they're able to set aside their differences. And then she responds, oh, it's a bodice ripper, isn't it? Usually the love scenes are towards the back. And of course he basically tries to defend this. And I am very much paraphrasing that. It is definitely, the prose is better than what I was doing. I was just kind of pulling out the spoken text to illustrate the point. But I found that to be actually really kind of funny, because this book right there, it kind of tells you, at least hints at, where this story is going. So that brief description kind of sounds a lot like this book. And then it continues on in the next chapter and gives kind of a dark ending for that book, for that story, which might be, a little bit of a foreshadowing for how this book ends. So I found that to be very, very interesting. In fact, it's not just the book. They even go to a play about the book. So this kind of reinforces that this is almost a reflection of the greater story. And I'm curious how much more we're going to learn about this inside story within the novel. So far, I've really been enjoying this book. I do have to push myself a little bit to suspend my disbelief, just because some of the tropes I don't think, at least they're not to my tastes, but they might be for yours. And I found these the actual magic so far to be, as I mentioned earlier, I found that to be my favorite part of this book so far. With multiple different magic systems that these characters use, it does open a lot of opportunities for this to be kind of a cool, interesting fantasy story that I might really enjoy as this book goes forward. Even if maybe there's the romance isn't maybe my favorite part, as long as there's something I'm getting out of the story, I'll be happy that I read the book. So be sure to come back next week. Lana will also be here, and the two of us will review Serpent and Dove together. And we'll give you our thoughts about the book, its world, its magic, and we'll rate it on our S tier charts, and we should be able to kind of figure out whether this is the kind of book that you might be interested in reading. The following week, we will start up with Novola, and Lana will be doing the midpoint review for that. So be sure to like and subscribe. Within the last month, the channel's been doing extremely well, and we're both very grateful to all of our viewers. We also have a Discord, links down below, where you can join us and discuss this and other books. Both the audience and the hosts of the show, we've reviewed other books that we're not covering on the show. Just a way for us to kind of share our collective, brain trust for fantasy novels and other novels that we all might enjoy.